So far, the international coalition against the terrorist group includes 10 countries, including the United States. Shiite militia battle Islamic State fighters for control of the western part of Tikrit. New video shows members of the peace brigades trying to secure the area around Samarra, where they have sacred shrines. They've been fighting to retake Tikrit since it fell into the hands of the Islamic State back in June. The European Union will wait a few days to see whether a ceasefire in eastern Ukraine holds before putting another round of sanctions into effect. That's partly because of resistance from Finland and other EU countries with strong economic ties to Russia. CCTV's Jack Barton joins us now from Brussels with more. Jack.
Well, that's right. Those sanctions that were announced on Monday were fairly significant, the toughest we've seen so far, some of the toughest targeting Russia's oil sector, blocking access to European capital markets for those companies, oil companies, that have a majority government stake in them. But now we've heard about this delay as the EU officials say they want more time to monitor the ceasefire in eastern Ukraine to see if it holds, to see if there is an improvement on the ground there. And of course, as you just mentioned, the delay comes amid strong resistance to these measures from countries like Finland, but as well as other EU nations that have very strong economic ties to Russia. A 15% downturn in German exports to Russia and a damage bill ranging up to 5 billion euros for EU farmers. Those are just some of the costs so far to Europe's economy, resulting from its row with Russia, which has led to mounting sanctions heading both east and west.
But the situation is still evolving, and the measures, both those taken by the EU and those taken by Russia, have been taken just a couple of months or in the last month. So we still need some time to properly assess the economic effect of the measures.
This week, the EU raised the stakes, announcing new Russian sanctions targeting major state oil firms, including Rosneft. But there is strong resistance to new measures from countries like Finland, Slovakia and Cyprus, which have deep trade links with Russia. And the EU is now treading cautiously. Brussels is being deliberately vague about when the new sanctions will take effect, allowing more time for a better assessment of the ceasefire in eastern Ukraine amid reports of further shelling and casualties. European Commission officials have suggested the new sanctions could be reversed if conditions on the ground in eastern Ukraine improve.
The ceasefire appears to be holding with some incidents, and we will continue to follow the situation.
In Brussels, there is also a growing sense that the EU sanctions are not altering the behavior of Russia or its leader, Vladimir Putin.
Russia has a very high threshold for pain, so if he's really determined, and he seems to be determined to keep control over the territories in eastern Ukraine, he might continue despite the EU sanctions.
If and when the new sanctions do take effect, Russia has threatened to retaliate by banning EU flights from its airspace, a move that would cost both Russia and the European Union further economic pain. And we were told that the details of the new sanctions would be published on Wednesday, but when EU officials were pressed today for about 15 minutes for a firm answer to that, there was no easy answer from those officials, saying there may be delays, the sanctions would be reviewed if the ceasefire held. So, we haven't had a very clear answer on whether all of those sanctions are going to be pushed through, but there does certainly seem to be resistance to them coming from Brussels itself at this point.
And clearly this resistance you're talking about among EU nations, is that simply because of its economic impact?
Well, there certainly is a large economic impact. There are varying estimates. We've heard estimates that this year, this row could cost the EU up to the equivalent of 16 billion US dollars. Many countries resisting, Finland being chief amongst them, but also countries like Italy and Germany was also very resistant to sanctions for a long time. German Chancellor Angela Merkel really coming on board late in the game. But it's not just about the economic angle. There's also the big issue, are the sanctions working? Because these sanctions were not intended to punish Russia. They were intended to try and coax the Kremlin into easing the situation in eastern Ukraine and into removing its alleged military presence in the east of that country. And officials here are largely conceding that really hasn't happened. But what's the other option? Of course, the only other option is a military option, and everybody says that's absolutely off the table. So right now, there are only sanctions. They're being implemented, even if it's reluctantly.
All right. Thank you so much, Jack Barton, live in Brussels. Now.